Factoring and invoice discounting. Invoice finance can be divided into two categories: factoring and invoice discounting. Factoring overview. A factoring company will purchase a company's accounts receivable ledger and will provide for each invoice on the ledger that is approved. The invoice financier will become responsible for the ledger. It is their job to chase up debtors and allocate payments received against outstanding balances. The value that the invoice financier brings to the table is his or her experience in debt management. Here is a step-by-step look at the process of factoring. A company sells goods or services to one of their customers. This customer is sent an invoice by the company. The customer is the debtor. On the invoice will be a notice of assignment. This is to notify the debtor that an invoice financier is involved in the debt management. The company sells the invoice to the invoice financier. The invoice financier pays some of the money due from the invoice to the company. When the invoice reaches payment date, the debtor will send payment to the invoice financier. The invoice financier, once he or she has removed fees, sends the balance to the company. Different types of factoring products. There are 5 types of factoring products. 1. Recourse factoring. Recourse is a legal term and it means the right to demand payment. In recourse factoring, if the debtor does not pay their debt after the time delay specified on the invoice, then the factoring company has the legal right to reclaim the money it sent to the company as a result of entering into a factoring agreement for the unpaid invoice. With recourse factoring, the invoice financier is protected against unpaid debt. 2. Non-recourse factoring. This is the opposite of recourse factoring. With this product, the invoice financier does not have the legal right to recall its early payment if the debtor does not pay. 3. Client handles own credit control. CHOC. In this type of factoring arrangement, it is the company who manages the credit controls, whereas in factoring it is the invoice financier who manages the debt from the unpaid invoices. In this situation, the company deals directly with its customer to facilitate the payment of invoices. 4. Export factoring. For a British company, export factoring is used if their customer is outside the UK. This product will use an affiliate to do the credit control. This affiliate will be a factoring company in the same country as the customer. Once the affiliate invoice financier has secured payment from the customer, it will send the money to the UK-based invoice financier, who then takes their fees and remits the balance to the British company. 5. Service-only factoring. This is a factoring product for companies that do not require funding. It could be argued that this is not really a factoring product since a company does not get early payments by selling its invoices to an invoice financier. Rather, the company hires the invoice financier to provide credit controls. In this arrangement, the invoice financier might offer credit cover for unpaid finances. It can be seen that the different types of factoring products focus mainly on who is financially responsible for failing to secure payment for an unpaid invoice. The other main consideration is who provides credit control. In the case of export factoring, the main difference to recourse and non-recourse factoring products is that a second invoice financier is used who has local knowledge. Invoice discounting. With invoice discounting, a company sells unpaid invoices in bulk to an invoice financier. The company is responsible for collecting on these invoices. Here is a breakdown of the invoice discounting process. A company sells goods or services to customers and sends them invoices. The company sells a batch of unpaid invoices to an invoice financier. The invoice financier pays some of the money due for the invoices to the company. The company collects its money from its customers and places the cash in a joint trust account. This account is set up by the company and the invoice financier. Crucially, it is only the invoice financier that can make withdrawals from the account. The invoice financier withdraws the money from the joint trust account, deducts the fee, and sends the balance to the company. Different types of invoice discounting products. There are 3 types of invoice discounting products that banks and factoring firms offer. They are: 1. Disclosed invoice discounting. In this type of invoice discounting, the invoices will hold a notice of assignment so the customer can see that an invoice financier is involved. 2. Confidential invoice discounting. As the title suggests, this is the opposite of disclosed invoice discounting. In this instance, the invoice does not hold a notice of assignment. The arrangement between the invoice financier and the company is kept confidential. Free, non-recourse invoice discounting. In this type of invoice discounting, if an invoice is not paid by a debtor, then it is the invoice financier who absorbs the costs. As mentioned above, recourse means having the legal right to reclaim money in the case of bad debt. Without the right of recourse, the invoice financier cannot reclaim its prepayment if the debtor defaults. In summary, invoice financing can be considered to consist of two categories: factoring and invoice discounting. The one key difference between these two categories is that in factoring, the money from the invoices are paid directly into the account of the invoice financier. In invoice discounting, the money is paid into a joint trust account. Also, it is the seller that does credit control and invoice discounting. The competence of the invoice financier is crucial in both factoring and invoice discounting. Their debt management skills are as important as the funds they provide to a company seeking the early release of money from its generated invoices. So much so that companies often use invoice financiers to just control debt rather than procure funds against unpaid invoices.